The Fremantle crayfish craze. In Fremantle, Western Australia, a port city that's lived and breathed the ocean for generations, 2022 brought a story that suddenly changed the local mood. The people of Freo are used to living by the sea's rhythm. Every morning, the fishing boat harbour is a chaotic mess of return trawlers, offloading rock lobster, crays, pink snapper, and squid. The sharp tang of sea salt mixes with diesel fumes. The shouts of deckhands echo as, amidst it all, local mums and restaurant owners haggle over the freshest catch for their kitchens. For as long as anyone can remember, spiced crayfish shreds have been a local staple. The fine, savoury fibres, preserved to last, are perfect on hot, buttered toast or stirred through pasta. For the old-timers in Fremantle, these shreds are a taste of childhood. Many can still picture their mums standing in old linoleum kitchens, patiently frying off spices, then stirring the dried crayfish until the rich aroma filled the house. This simple food was tucked into school lunchboxes, became a snack on long drives, and even helped stretch the budget when money was tight. The shreds weren't just food, they were a symbol of stoic, working-class family love. But in 2022, something strange happened. A tiny, unassuming shopfront in a narrow laneway near the old port suddenly started selling spiced crayfish shreds with a different taste. From the outside, the place was nothing. Grimy brick walls, a rusted corrugated iron door, no sign or flashy promotion. There was just an old woman who sometimes sat on a plastic milk crate out front. But the moment the shreds from that shop got out, the whole of Freo was buzzing. This version had a glistening, golden red color. The shreds were perfectly dry and crisp, yet somehow melted on the tongue. The moment it hit hot, buttered toast, an intense, savory aroma erupted, tempting you before you'd even taken a bite. When you did, there was a perfect balance of sweet and salt, leaving a strange, compelling aftertaste that made you desperate for another. The first people who tried it said it was nothing like the others. There was something unexplainable, a pull that made them crave it again. The news spread bloody quick. At the Fremantle markets, mums who were usually busy haggling over veggies were now asking each other which shop sold those special shreds. Other stallholders got curious. Some even prepaid mates to grab them a jar. One or two photos popped up on Instagram, showing the fine, glowing red shreds in a glass jar. The captions just made people more curious. "One bite and you're hooked," one wrote. Another said, "It tastes like something that makes your heart feel calm and anxious at the same time." This phenomenon led to long queues snaking down the laneway every time a new batch was ready. People were willing to wait from dawn, bringing folding camp chairs. Some even paid for Ubers just to hold their spot in the line. The price doubled, then tripled. But it still sold out within hours. In the corner pub, the old-timers discussed it with baffled tones. Old Mick, a neighbour who lived a few doors down, claimed he often heard a strange grinding machine running until the middle of the night. He said it wasn't a normal rhythm, it was erratic, sometimes stopping suddenly then lurching back to life like the gasping breath of someone exhausted. Some laughed him off, saying he was just an old bloke getting suspicious. But a few young blokes, walking home late from the pub, swore they heard a similar sound. Meanwhile, in homes across the city, the spiced crayfish shreds were suddenly king. Everyone was scrambling to buy them, gripped by curiosity. It became the talk of the town. Kids were whinging if they didn't get it on their toast for breakfast. One woman even told her friends her husband, usually a small eater, was now smashing seconds and thirds ever since trying the magic shreds. Families started hoarding jars in the back of the fridge like it was gold, terrified of running out. In the midst of this euphoria, a few quiet doubts surfaced. Sharon, a local fruit and veg vendor, muttered one day, "How can it be that good? I know what goes into it. It's just cray, spices, and onions. What makes it so different?" But curiosity was stronger than fear. People kept buying, kept praising, and kept ignoring the questions nagging at the back of their minds. The local Salvo's captain even mentioned the craze in a community newsletter, warning folks not to get so caught up in worldly pleasures. He said the tongue can deceive the heart, and what tastes good isn't always a blessing. But that warning was drowned out by the noise of people still hunting for the magic crayfish shreds. Days passed, and demand exploded. There were buyers from Perth, Bunbury, and even from over east in Melbourne and Sydney, driving or flying in just to get some. They bought dozens of jars as gifts for their families. Online sellers started reselling them, fanning the flames of the frenzy. A new batch would be released, and hundreds of jars would be gone in an hour. In Fremantle, a city built on stories of fishermen and port traditions, a single taste had managed to change the face of the community. Those fragrant shreds were now a new symbol of pride, but also a baffling mystery. No one knew who was really making it. No one ever saw the process, because the iron door to the shop was always locked. And behind that door, a dark secret was waiting. A story that would soon rock all of Western Australia. Those shreds weren't just food. They were the beginning of a terrifying secret. Behind that small iron door stood the figure of a woman rarely seen in public. Her name was Margaret. To her neighbours, she was known as the old woman with striking white hair always pulled into a tight bun, invariably wearing a neat, old-fashioned floral print dress. Her steps were slow, her voice never loud, but one look from her eyes made people automatically look away. No one dared use her name casually. Kids in the laneway only whispered when she walked past. The few staff in her shop barely spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Margaret's presence was like a shadow that commanded the room without a sound. Decades ago, she'd been through hard times. Her husband, a wharfie docker, had died in a loading accident at the port. At the time, Margaret had only just started her small-time business making the shreds. Many thought she'd give up. But the opposite happened. She got up without tears, cleaned up the damaged equipment herself, and went back to work as if she'd never fallen. From then on, she was known as a woman tough as nails, but also increasingly private. They say after the accident, Margaret never again let anyone else control the process. She chose the crayfish herself, weighed the spices, and watched over every single stage. There was no written recipe. It was all in her head. Her workers were only given the outside jobs, weighing, packing, or delivering. The core process remained her secret. People who had briefly worked there often said the atmosphere inside was completely different from the market. It was silent, orderly, and full of rules. If Margaret wasn't smiling, the room felt cold, even on a scorching Frio Avo. If she was walking down the hall, all the workers would lower their heads. No one dared ask why the door to the main processing room was always locked. No one dared look inside when it was open just a crack. The only person remotely close to her was her son, Liam. But even that closeness had limits. Liam was only responsible for deliveries and talking to customers. Even as her own son, he was never allowed into the main processing room. The key was always on a chain around Margaret's neck, like a talisman she never took off. To outsiders, all this just added to the mystery. They saw a simple old woman, but from behind her eyes, you could feel the weight of a heavy secret. A neighbor said, ever since her shreds got famous, Margaret's face is even harder to read. Sometimes she gives a little smile, but it's more like a cold line than any real warmth. There was a story about a young bloke named Kyle who'd only worked there for a week. He said one night he saw a light on from under the locked door, even though it was late. Curious, he got closer, but before he could see anything, Margaret was suddenly standing right behind him. In a quiet but firm voice, she said, not all doors are meant to be opened. The next morning, Carl didn't come back. When neighbors asked, he just said, couldn't hack the work there. Despite the mystery, the community treated Margaret with respect. They saw her as a tough old bird who'd successfully put Fremantle's crayfish shreds on the map. She never got angry in public, never yelled, but that's exactly why people were so wary of her. In her every movement, there was an authority that made everyone careful. Sophie, the daughter-in-law who'd married Liam, often felt like an outsider in front of Margaret. Every time she came in with fresh energy, taking photos of the product for Instagram, or suggesting new packaging designs, Margaret's gaze remained the same, flat and unreadable. There was no rejection, but no warm approval either. It was as if Margaret let Sophie operate on the outside, but kept her at bay with an invisible wall. The locals got used to this mysterious figure. They rarely saw Margaret leave her house, except to go to the shop. Even when a neighbor had a party, she'd just send a small gift without attending. Many whispered that she was hiding too many secrets. But because her crayfish shreds were so popular, people chose to stay quiet. In Fremantle, Margaret's name eventually became a small legend. Some called her a strong woman, others called her too secretive. But no one could deny that behind the iron door that was always locked, there was something that no one else was allowed to know. And with every passing day, that secret was growing, like a swell on the ocean, just waiting for the right moment to break. Liam, Margaret's only son, was the complete opposite of his mother. He had a gentle face and a soft look in his eyes, as if he still held on to the last traces of the artist he'd once dreamt of being, a muso playing guitar in a small bar in Melbourne. But since his father died, he'd left that dream behind and come home to Fremantle to support his mum. Now, every day, he rode an old postie bike, delivering jars of shreds to customers. People at the market knew him as the quiet bloke. He rarely spoke, just offered a brief smile and moved on. But behind his silence, many felt sympathy. A few times, people saw Liam sitting alone on the shop's veranda, staring at the jars, as if he was listening to something no one else could hear. His wife, Sophie, on the other hand, had a bright personality. She'd grown up in Melbourne, used to the city buzz. Her hair was dyed a light brown, her steps were quick, and her voice was friendly to everyone. She was the one who first had the idea to photograph the product, upload it to Instagram, and do live videos every time a new batch was ready. Thanks to Sophie, the crayfish shreds, once only known in the local market, suddenly appeared on the tables of restaurants in Perth and even Bunbury. Sophie brought new energy to the family business. She redesigned the labels, adding a small ribbon to make them look more upmarket. She also built partnerships with gift shops and even contacted major distributors in Perth. To outsiders, Sophie was a ray of light in the shop's gloomy atmosphere. However, all that light seemed to dim when she faced Margaret. Whenever Sophie entered the shop, the workers seemed to cheer up. The vibe became livelier. But Margaret's expression stayed the same, calm, but rigid. No comments, no thank you. It was as if all of Sophie's hard work was just wind passing by. Sophie had tried to get closer several times. She told her husband, "I'd love to learn how to make the shreds directly from your mum, so I can help out properly one day." But Margaret's answer was always the same, short and cold. "You stick to the sales, love. I'll handle the kitchen." After that, Sophie stopped pushing, but the curiosity remained in her eyes. Every time she walked down the shop's hallway, she'd glance at the locked iron door. It was only from there that the strong aroma of fresh shreds would waft, mixed with the smell of onions and something else, something unfamiliar. Sophie and Liam's relationship was actually good. Liam loved his wife in his own quiet way. He'd often drive her to the markets or sit with her while she did her live videos. Though he just sat in the corner without talking, sometimes he looked agitated. Especially when Sophie got too enthusiastic about asking how the shreds were made. Liam knew there was a line he couldn't cross. The workers also saw how Margaret treated her daughter-in-law. They whispered that the old woman had never really accepted Sophie, even if she never openly rejected her. Their relationship was like a thin, taut thread, not broken, but never loose. One time, Sophie tried bringing a small camera to film the atmosphere in the outer packing area. She wanted to make a simple promo video. But as soon as the camera's red light went on, Margaret suddenly appeared behind her. In a low, clear voice, she said, "Not everything needs to be put on show." Sophie froze, then turned the camera off. She never tried to film inside the shop again. From the outside, though, everything looked fine. Sales were up, customers were growing, and Sophie was becoming well-known online. Many women in Perth followed her videos, praising her friendliness. But inside the house, she still felt the chill from her mother-in-law. Every time they had dinner together, the conversation was brief. Liam would occasionally try to break the ice, but Margaret was mostly silent. That small unease slowly grew into a real question in Sophie's heart. Why was Margaret so fiercely protective of the recipe? Why was that main room door always locked, and why, every time she asked, did she get a short answer that shut down the conversation? One afternoon, as a light drizzle fell over Fremantle, Sophie stood for a long time in front of that iron door. Her hand almost touched the handle. But then she heard Margaret's footsteps from behind. With a thin smile, Margaret just said, "Don't forget to shut the kitchen window, love. There's a draft." Sophie started, quickly backing away. And from that moment, she felt more certain than ever that something was being hidden behind that door. She didn't know that her curiosity would soon drag her toward a fate she could never have imagined. That day, a light drizzle had been falling since noon. Fremantle was blanketed in a grey sky. The smell of the salt air mixed with the damp earth. As usual, Sophie came to the shop carrying a cloth bag with her phone and a small tripod. She had just finished a live video at the markets. Her face was still fresh, though her clothes were damp from the rain. Her voice had been cheerful, as she offered jars of shreds to her followers on screen. As usual, she was met with smiles and comments. In the front room of the shop, a few workers were packing orders. The shreds were sealed in clear bags, wrapped in gold-colored paper, then put into cardboard boxes. Sophie stood beside them, sometimes helping, sometimes joking with the young staff. Her presence always brightened the place. No one knew it would be the last time they saw her smile. That evening, after the other workers had gone home, Sophie was still at the shop. She said she wanted to wait for Liam, who was doing a delivery run up to Perth. A neighbor saw her standing out front of the shop, talking on her mobile. After that, no one saw her leave. The next morning, the online customer chat group was suddenly quiet. Sophie's social media account, usually bustling with promotional posts, was inactive. Messages piled up. Customer queries went unanswered. A few people thought she was just sick or taking a break. But as the days passed, the silence became more unsettling. Her phone went straight to voicemail. When a worker dared to ask Margaret, the reply was calm. "She's gone back to Melbourne. Her mum's crook. Nothing to worry about." The answer sounded plausible, but it slowly raised questions. Sophie's family in Melbourne were shocked when they heard the news. Her mum was in perfect health, no one was seriously ill. They hadn't heard a word from Sophie themselves. Liam looked even more haunted. He barely spoke. His eyes were often empty, staring at the floor. Whenever someone asked about his wife, he just answered curtly, "She's fine," but his lips were dry, his hands trembled, as if he was carrying a heavy burden he couldn't share. Meanwhile, activity at the shop actually ran smoother. Margaret now stepped in to manage sales directly. She contacted the big customers, arranged the shipping, and even occasionally delivered orders herself. Strangely, even without Sophie's online presence, sales didn't drop. In fact, demand increased. The crayfish shreds from that shop became even more popular. The workers started to whisper, "Why, after Sophie disappeared, did the shreds taste even better than before?" Some said the fibers were softer, others said the aroma was deeper. One young worker even joked with a pale face, "It's like they've got an ingredient that's addictive now." No one laughed. They all fell silent. Only the sound of the grinding machine from the locked room echoed. Old Mick, the elderly neighbor, also felt something was off. Several nights after Sophie vanished, he heard the machine working much later than usual. A sharp, antiseptic-like smell seeped through the gap in his window. He wanted to complain, but he stopped every time he remembered Margaret's cold stare. A full week passed with no word. Sophie had vanished off the face of the earth. No texts, no calls, no trace. People started to get uneasy. A few loyal customers tried contacting Liam, but he became even more withdrawn. The shop workers didn't dare ask any more questions. At the Frio markets, the stallholders who used to chat with Sophie started wondering. A close friend of hers said that just 2 days before she disappeared, Sophie had been planning to celebrate her birthday at a small cafe near the beach. That celebration never happened. The silence turned into fear. It was as if a thin veil had been draped over reality, and everyone was choosing to pretend they didn't see it. The shreds kept being produced. Jar after jar came out of the shop. From the outside, it looked like a runaway success. But in the hearts of those who knew Sophie, there was an emptiness that was hard to explain. In Fremantle, the disappearance of a friendly, well-known young woman should have been big news. But strangely, this time, everyone seemed quiet. There were only whispers in the market corners, only suspicious glances from neighbors. Only silent prayers from a family who didn't know where to look. And behind it all, the iron door to the processing room remained firmly locked, guarding a secret that was, day by day, becoming more terrifying. The days turned into weeks without Sophie. 1 week became 2, then a month. People started to get used to her absence, though they still held on to their questions. At the market, customers who used to chat warmly with her now just asked in a hushed voice, "Any word from Sophie?" And the answer was always the same, "She's back home, looking after her mum." But there were so many holes in that story. Sophie's phone was still dead. Her social media was dark. No letters or messages ever reached her family in Melbourne. And most telling of all, whenever anyone dared to probe further, Margaret's face remained calm. She'd answer only what was necessary, then change the subject. Liam sank deeper into his silence. He no longer did the daily deliveries, his mother had taken over most of that. He was often seen sitting in the small storage shed behind the shop, staring blankly at the concrete wall. Sometimes he'd be holding his old guitar, but he rarely plucked the strings. They were covered in dust. The music had died along with his smile. The workers felt the change, too. Before, when Sophie was doing a live video, they'd all feel the buzz. Now, the shop felt cold. The machines still ran. The jars of shreds still lined the shelves. But there was no laughter. The rich aroma of the shreds now felt suffocating, as if it were hiding something. A few workers started talking about the strange things they'd experienced. A young bloke named Kyle said he often heard the grinder working in the middle of the night, long after production was supposed to have stopped. He'd also seen a light on from under the locked iron door. When he asked Margaret, her answer was brief, preparing a big special order. A woman named Sarah confessed she'd sometimes smell a stinging hospital-like smell mixed with the aroma of the shreds. It made her dizzy. But when she mentioned it, Margaret just stared at her with sharp eyes and said, "If you don't like the smell, love, the door's right there." Sarah went quiet, though her heart was pounding. Meanwhile, sales were booming. Major restaurants in Perth were ordering in bulk. There were even requests from Sydney. People said the shreds had a unique flavour, impossible to forget. They called it magic shreds, one bite and you're hooked. The phenomenon made the shop busier, but also more secretive. Old Mick, the neighbour 2 lanes over, grew more suspicious. One night, he walked past the back of the shop. From a ventilation slit, he heard a sound. Like something heavy being dragged. Then, the sound of a high-pressure hose, as if someone was washing something down. A rank, coppery smell hit him, making his stomach turn. He was about to knock, but his feet felt heavy, as if a shadow was holding him back. He went home, his chest tight, and never dared to go near the back of the shop again. Liam himself was trapped. He knew something was terribly wrong, especially since Sophie disappeared. But every time he tried to ask his mother, the answer was just a cold, "Stay out of it." Liam would look down, his eyes filled with anxiety. Several times, workers saw him standing for a long time in front of the iron door. His hand would almost touch the handle, but he'd always pull back when he heard his mother's footsteps. Amidst all the strangeness, the shop kept running. Delivery vans came and went. Customers praised the taste. The money flowed in. From the outside, it was a picture of success. But from the inside, there was an unexplainable fear. People started whispering at the market. Was Sophie's disappearance somehow connected to why the shreds were suddenly so bloody good? Some laughed it off as gossip. But others went silent, quietly choosing not to buy anymore, even if they were too scared to say why. Margaret kept walking with her steady gait. Her white hair was in its neat bun, her face blank. Whenever she passed the workers, they automatically looked down. No one dared to meet her eyes for too long. There was an invisible power in her that made people feel small. And behind that iron door, the secret just got thicker. The machine ran non-stop. The strange smell grew more frequent. And the shadow of Sophie seemed to cling to the walls of the shop. Every night, Liam thought he heard a sound, faint and distant. Maybe it was just in his head, or maybe it was from behind the wall. Like his wife's voice, calling softly, drowned out by the thrum of the machine. The silence had now become a quiet terror. No one dared to ask anymore, but everyone felt that there was something far darker going on than just crayfish shreds. The nights in Fremantle grew longer for the shop workers. The sound of the grinder, usually only heard during the day, now often rumbled late into the night. For the neighbours, it sounded like groaning metal being dragged, mixed with a low electric hum. Kyle, the young man who often had to lift the sacks of crayfish, was heading home late one night. He cut through the laneway behind the shop, and saw a dim light leaking from under the iron door. Curiosity made him creep closer. Through a tiny gap, he saw a shadow. Someone hosing down the big industrial grinder. Water sprayed everywhere, hitting the wall, leaving faint reddish-brown streaks. Kyle recoiled, stumbling back and knocking over an empty bucket. The clang of metal echoed. The shadow inside froze. He held his breath and ran as fast as he could. The next day, Kyle worked as usual. But when he looked at Margaret, the old woman just smiled thinly. She wasn't angry, she didn't ask questions. She just looked at him, as if she knew everything. That look made Kyle tremble all day. The smell was getting worse, too. Sarah, who worked in packing, felt dizzy several times when she opened a fresh batch. She smelled a strong, chemical odor, like a hospital, mixed with the smell of burnt hair. Once, she whispered to Liam, "There's something different in this batch, Liam." Liam turned, his eyes bloodshot, but he just muttered, "Just keep your head down and do your work." The atmosphere inside the shop had changed. No more jokes, just the sound of machines and scraping metal. The staff worked in silence. Their eyes often met, sharing a mutual anxiety. They all knew something was wrong, but no one dared to be the one to ask. One morning, a new kid named Ben suddenly didn't show up. He'd only been working there a week, still green, always asking questions. The night before, he'd been seen helping carry sacks into the inner room. The next morning, his bed in the staff accommodation was empty. When asked, Margaret's reply was brief. He wasn't cut out for the work. He's gone. No further explanation. Ben's belongings were gone, too. As if he'd never been there. The whispers grew louder. Some workers believed Ben had just left, but others were sure something had happened. Sarah cried quietly in the corner of the kitchen, terrified every time she had to walk past that iron door. Old Mick, the elderly neighbor, was becoming more _caption. Several times, he had nightmares. He'd see a young woman with dyed brown hair standing in front of the shop. Her face was pale, her lips moving without a sound. When he woke up, he could still smell the stinging odor that drifted in on the night air. He started to wonder. Was that Sophie's spirit, unable to rest? Meanwhile, the crayfish shreds were more in demand than ever. Customers from Sydney were even willing to pay double to get them. They said the taste was getting stronger, more compelling. A restaurant owner said at an event, "These shreds have a flavor you can't explain. It's like something that sticks to your tongue and to your memory." Every time she heard praise like that, Margaret would just smile thinly. Her hands stayed busy, writing down orders, as if everything was perfectly normal. But behind that smile, there was a darkness that made anyone shiver if they looked too long. Liam was drowning. He rarely left the house, rarely spoke, barely ate. Sometimes, workers saw him standing for a long time in front of the iron door, his hands clutching his old guitar, his face empty. Some said they'd seen him wiping away tears when the aroma of a new batch wafted out too strongly. For the workers, the shop was no longer a place to earn a living. It felt like a prison. They worked because they were afraid of losing their jobs, but every day felt like walking on thin ice. No one knew when the secret behind the iron door would finally be revealed, or when they themselves might become part of that secret. The following nights, the grinder sounded louder, the smell grew more pungent, and fear became a habit. Everyone tried to turn a blind eye, as if pretending not to know would keep them safe. But the whispers never really went away. Everyone knew that ever since Sophie disappeared, the crayfish shop was no longer just a food production kitchen. It had become something else. Something much, much darker. The phenomenon of the Fremantle crayfish shreds began to spread beyond WA. Where it was once just a local secret, those little jars were now appearing on tables in Perth, Sydney, and Melbourne. People talked about it on social media, calling it the most delicious thing they'd ever tasted. In a Perth cafe, a food blogger tried it on a live feed. After one spoonful, his expression changed. He said, his voice trembling slightly, "It's not like normal jerky. It's not just crayfish. There's a sweetness, a saltiness, but also something deep that lingers. I can't explain it." His followers were mesmerized. Comments flooded in, and orders skyrocketed. A woman in Sydney posted that after eating the shreds, she just started crying for no reason. Her eyes were wet, her chest felt tight, but her hand kept scooping up more. She wrote, "I don't know why, but it made me miss someone I know. Someone who's gone." A similar experience was reported by a uni student in Melbourne. He was usually a vegetarian, but when he tried a bit of the shreds, he couldn't stop. That night, he had a bizarre nightmare. He dreamt of long, brown hair tangled in the shreds on his plate. He woke up in a cold sweat, but strangely, he still wanted to eat more. Stories like these spread fast. People started calling the Fremantle shreds haunting or supernatural. Some linked it to old spirits. Others assumed it was an ancient recipe known only to one family. But the more people asked, the fewer answers they got. At the shop, Margaret just kept working calmly. Her smile was thin, her gaze deep. Every time she heard a customer's wild praise, she'd just nod, as if she knew all along. Liam grew more sullen, but he wouldn't speak. The workers heard the strange stories, too. Sarah, the one who'd felt dizzy from the smell, one day accidentally tasted a small bit that had fallen on the counter. That night, she dreamed her body was being covered in fine red fibers, growing out of her skin. She screamed in her sleep, waking her roommate. The next morning, she was pale and terrified. But weirdly, her tongue still craved the taste. The phenomenon even made the local news. A Channel 7 crew filmed a segment on the little shop in Freo, showing the long queues. A reporter asked Margaret the secret to the taste. With that same thin smile, she answered briefly, "Just fresh craze and an old family recipe. Nothing more." That simple answer just made people more curious. But behind the praise, other whispers were emerging. Some people asked if the shreds contained an addictive substance. Some suspected it was mixed with chemicals. A doctor in Perth said he'd had a few patients complain of dizziness and nausea after eating too much of the product. But when he ran tests, the lab results showed nothing unusual. Meanwhile, customers kept flooding the shop. The delivery vans left every day, carrying hundreds of jars to other cities. The money poured in. The workers got busier. But amidst the hustle, the fear never left. Old Mick, the neighbor, was now convinced something was deeply wrong. He saw the faces of the people leaving the shop, clutching their jars. Their eyes were shining, like they were carrying treasure. He muttered to himself, "Food's not meant to make people look like that. There's something darker in it." And in the Fremantle nights, the whispers grew. People started to ask themselves, are we really eating crayfish? Or something else? Something that should never, ever have made it to a dinner table. One morning, a regular customer named Sharon rushed into the shop. Her face was pale, her hands shaking, and she was holding a jar of shreds she'd bought the week before. Her voice trembled as she said, "When I opened this jar, there was this weird smell. Not just crayfish." Then she showed them a small object she'd found inside. It was hard, pale yellowish, about the size of a corn kernel. When a worker looked closer, they could see tiny, fine grooves like a joint. Sharon whispered, "I thought it was just a bit of shell. But the more I looked at it, I got scared." Margaret immediately snatched the jar. Her eyes were calm. "It's just a bit of crayfish cartilage, love. Nothing to worry about." Her voice was flat, leaving no room for argument. Sharon fell silent, then left, her steps unsteady. But the incident left a new anxiety among the workers. They whispered to each other, was that really just cartilage, or something else? A few days later, a young worker named Matt was cleaning up some spilled shreds. He felt something hard under his fingertips. When he looked, it was a small, thin, curved sliver. It looked exactly like a piece of a fingernail. His face went white. He quickly hid it in his pocket. But from the corner of the room, Margaret was standing there, watching. Her smile was thin, her eyes sharp. Matt trembled, then pretended to keep cleaning. He couldn't sleep that night. He kept feeling the small object in his pocket, and finally, full of guilt, he chucked it into the Frio harbor. Stories like that became more frequent. A customer complained the new batch smelled too sharp. Another said the taste felt like it was mixed with something foreign. But strangely, they all kept buying. That very strangeness seemed to make them even more addicted. In homes around Fremantle, young kids started screaming for the shreds at every meal. One boy refused to eat anything at all without it. His mother was baffled but didn't dare refuse, because the child would throw a violent tantrum every time they ran out. Old Mick was increasingly distressed. He heard the stories of the strange bone, the fingernail, the weird smell, and the addicted children. He tried to warn a few neighbors to stop buying it, but the answer was always the same: "It's too bloody good, Mick. We can't stop." He could only sigh, feeling alone in his suspicion. At the shop, the atmosphere grew more oppressive. The workers moved in silence. Every step felt like it was being watched. The strange smell was more common now, especially when the big grinder was turned on. Sometimes they smelled hot metal. Sometimes, they smelled burnt hair mixed with the aroma of crayfish. Liam was drowning in his grief. He barely spoke, rarely went out. Several times, workers saw him just sitting on the ground in front of the locked iron door. His eyes were red, his face pale. Someone said they once saw him break down in tears when he heard the sound of the grinder start up from behind the door. Margaret just kept walking with her calm, steady pace. Her white hair was in its bun, her face blank. Whenever there was a complaint from a customer or a worker, she always had a short answer. "There's nothing strange. It's just the family recipe." And every time she said it, everyone went silent, too afraid to ask anything else. But the secret was getting harder to hide. The bits of bone, the small sliver, the strange smell, and the overpowering taste. It was all starting to form a dark story in the public's whispers. People began to wonder, were these crayfish shreds really just from the ocean, or had something from the land found its way in? And every night, the sound of the grinder from behind the iron door kept thrumming, swallowing the answers that were never spoken. Darren, the delivery driver who had worked at the shop for 2 years, was known as a simple, quiet bloke. He rarely talked, just focused on his job, running deliveries to Perth or Bunbury. That night, heavy rain was lashing the streets. He had to leave later than usual for a last-minute rush order for a big restaurant. In the shop's yard, a few workers were preparing cardboard boxes full of jars. Darren helped lift them. His hands were slick with rain. Suddenly, one of the cardboard boxes slipped from his grasp and fell hard onto the concrete. The sound of shattering glass echoed. Everyone froze. Margaret came out of the inner room, walking quickly. Her face was flat, but her eyes were sharp. She said curtly, "Be careful. That's money you're dropping." Darren crouched down to gather the broken jars. His hands were covered in the soft, red shreds scattered on the wet ground. As he was about to clean it up, his fingers brushed something hard. He felt around for it, then picked it up. A small, yellowish-white object. It was a short, cylindrical shape with a slightly curved end. It had fine grooves, like a joint. Darren's heart hammered. He knew that shape. Years ago, before he drove trucks, he'd been an orderly at Fremantle Hospital. He'd cleaned the morgue. His eyes were used to seeing human bones. And the thing in his hand right now, he was sure, was the top phalanx of a human pinky finger. Darren held his breath. He quickly palmed it, hiding it in his fist. He pretended to keep cleaning up the spilled shreds. From a distance, he could feel Margaret's eyes boring into his back. After everything was cleaned up, he got into his truck, his hands still shaking. The heavy rain hammered his windscreen. The wipers scraped back and forth. He drove slowly, navigating the narrow streets toward the highway. But his mind was racing. The small object in his pocket felt hot, like it was burning his skin. Halfway to Perth, Darren pulled over on a dark, empty stretch of road. He killed the engine, took a deep breath, and opened his hand. Under the dim cabin light, the object was unmistakable. A single joint from a human finger. It was clean, slick, as if it had been boiled. The end still showed the joint. Darren nearly threw up. He shut his eyes, but the image of Sophie's face flashed in his mind. Her warm smile, the last time he'd seen her, arranging jars for a live video. Since then, gone, without a trace. Darren felt his throat tighten. He realized what he'd found wasn't an accident. There was something horrific hidden in the shreds he'd been hauling all over the state. He'd carried hundreds of jars. Thousands of people had eaten it. And maybe, in every bite, there was a part of someone who had once been alive. Darren started the engine again, but his hands were still trembling. He felt like he wasn't just carrying food. He was carrying a bloody secret that had now trapped him, with no way out. That night, he didn't go straight home. After dropping off the delivery, he stopped at his small studio flat near the port. On his rickety wooden table, he placed the tiny bone, wrapping it in 3 layers of plastic. He stared at it, as if the thing was alive and watching him. His heart pounded like a drum. He knew if he stayed quiet, the secret would be buried forever. But if he opened his mouth, his own life could be on the line. Outside, the rain still poured, hammering the tin roof of his flat like a death knell. Darren sat hunched over, staring at the plastic-wrapped evidence. He whispered to himself, "This has to come out. If not, Sophie, or whoever else, they'll never get justice." That night, staring at the tiny finger bone he'd found, Darren felt his mind spinning. He couldn't sleep. The sound of the rain on his tin roof just made him more anxious. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie's face, followed by fleeting memories of the big grinder in the shop spinning late at night. He knew if he just spoke up without proof, no one would believe him. Margaret was too respected, her crayfish shreds too loved. Who would listen to a simple delivery driver? So, with shaking hands, he decided to write it all down. He grabbed a piece of paper from his kid's old-school notebook. He started writing slowly. "My name is Darren. I'm a driver for Margaret's crayfish shreds. I'm writing this because I'm scared something will happen to me. I found what I swear is a human bone in the shreds. I've seen blood being washed from the grinder. I'm scared. I think people are missing, including Sophie, the boss's daughter-in-law. If this letter gets to the police, it means I'm probably gone." A drop of sweat fell from his forehead onto the paper, smudging the ink. He folded the note carefully, and tucked it under a loose floorboard in his flat. After that, he put the plastic-wrapped bone into an old Bushell's coffee tin and sealed it tight. The next day, he went to work as usual. He started the truck, delivered the orders, greeted customers with a strained smile. But behind it, his heart was pounding. Every time he caught Margaret's eye, he felt like she could read his mind. Every time they passed in the hallway, a chill ran down his spine. He knew he couldn't report it openly. If Margaret found out, he'd be next. So he found another way. That night, he stopped at a local deli on his way home, pretending to write down delivery addresses in a notebook. But he was really copying the contents of his letter onto a fresh page. A few days later, on his Perth run, he made a point to drive past the WA police headquarters in the city. With a quick, nervous movement, he slipped the small envelope into a postbox out front. His hand was trembling, but he felt a small sense of relief. At least now, there was a trail that could lead to the truth. But he wasn't safe. Every night, the fear haunted him. He often woke up from nightmares. In his dreams, he'd see Sophie standing in front of his truck. Her face was pale, her hands covered in red shreds. She wouldn't speak, she'd just stare, her eyes wet with tears. At the shop, things got scarier. The grinder ran more often. The strange smell was stronger. Some of the other workers were getting jittery too. Sarah said she heard crying, soft and low, from behind the iron door, even when only Margaret was inside. Matt, the young guy who'd found the fingernail, quit, saying he was sick. He was never seen in the neighborhood again. Something big and dark was happening behind that door. And if he didn't act fast, more people would disappear. That night, he sat in his flat, staring at the coffee tin. He whispered, "I promise. I'll get the truth out. Even if it costs me." Outside, the sea breeze carried the smell of salt and hot metal. Fremantle was sinking into silence. While behind the small iron door of the shop, the grinder continued to hum, guarding a secret that was getting harder and harder to keep. In Perth, the police headquarters was busy with the morning rush of files. A mail clerk brought a stack of letters and dropped them on the intake desk. Among the dozens of ordinary envelopes, one caught the eye of a young detective, DS Jack Evans. It had no return address, just hurried writing on the front, "To someone who'll find the truth." Evans opened it slowly, his eyes narrowing as he read the shaky handwriting. The letter told a story about the famous Fremantle crayfish shreds, and the possibility that they were mixed with human flesh. He read every word, his heart picking up speed. It mentioned names vaguely. It described a grinder, a strange smell, and a woman named Sophie who had vanished. At first, he thought it might be a sick joke, or a smear campaign from a business rival. But the last sentence made him freeze. "I found a human bone in the shreds. I am keeping it. If you've received this letter, my life is in danger." Evans swallowed. He knew he couldn't ignore this. He took it to his boss, Detective Inspector Chen, a seasoned and tough-as-nails officer. The inspector read it quickly, then nodded slowly. "We can't be rash. If this is real, it's massive. If it's fake, it's slander that could ruin someone." They decided to form a small, off-the-books task force. No official file, just verbal orders. 2 undercover officers were sent to Freo, posing as council health inspectors doing a food safety survey. They started watching Margaret's shop from a distance, noting who went in and out, how often the grinder ran, and when deliveries were made. Back in Freo, Darren was living on a knife edge. He was partly relieved the letter was sent, but also terrified. He felt like he was being watched. Sometimes, when he was at a cafe, he'd see someone watching him from across the street. Sometimes, on a delivery, he'd hear a motorbike following him for a long time before vanishing. One night, he came home to his flat and found the door slightly ajar. He was sure he'd locked it. His heart hammered. He went inside cautiously. Nothing was gone. But the floorboard, the one where he'd hidden the first letter, looked like it had been moved. He immediately checked the coffee tin with the bone. It was still there. But the plastic wrapping, it wasn't how he'd left it. Darren gasped. It meant someone knew. Or at least, someone suspected. He put it back, then sat on the floor for a long time, staring into space. A voice whispered in his head, "I have to move faster, or I'll be the next one to disappear." Meanwhile, at the shop, Margaret showed no sign of suspicion. She kept smiling at customers, still gave firm instructions to her staff. But some felt her gaze was sharper, as if she already knew who had dared to defy her. One morning, Darren was called into the back room by Lucy, another worker. She looked pale. She whispered quickly, "I've been hearing things. Marg," she said, "there's a rat among us. A rat who's going to get everyone in trouble. You be careful, Daz." Darren just nodded, though he was shaking. He knew. He was the rat. In Perth, the detectives found new information. They uncovered an old missing person report from Fremantle that had never been solved. A young woman named Chloe, a casual worker at the shop. According to her family, she just never came home 3 months ago. A report was filed, but it went nowhere. It was all starting to connect to the anonymous letter. Di Chen realized this case was deeper than they'd thought. He ordered the team to find physical proof immediately, especially the bone mentioned in the letter. The problem was, they had no clear address for the sender. They just knew his name was Darren, a delivery driver. That night, in his small flat, Darren wrote again. He copied everything he knew into a new note. He wrote about the smell, the blood on the machine, the disappearance of Sophie and Chloe. He even drew a rough diagram of the grinder he'd glimpsed. When he finished, he stared out the window. The sea breeze carried the sound of the waves, mixed with the distant hum of a machine. His heart told him, the real fight is just beginning. At a small cafe in Perth, D.S. Evans sat with a black coffee. The table was covered with maps, surveillance photos of Margaret's shop, and a list of employees. He was still reeling from the contents of the letter. But as a detective, he knew his first job was to find the man who wrote it. Without that source, it was all just gossip. Through a network of informants, he got a lead on a driver named Darren. A man who, lately, had been keeping to himself, barely talking, and always looking over his shoulder. Evans's suspicion grew, this was his man. He decided to approach Darren carefully, indirectly. 2 days later, Darren was waiting for a loadout at the Fremantle markets. A middle-aged man greeted him casually, asking if Darren could help him deliver some goods to Perth. Darren looked at him, suspicious. He didn't recognize the face. He said curtly that he already had a full-time job. The man just nodded and walked away. From that day on, Darren felt he was being watched even more closely, not knowing the man was part of Evans's undercover team. Meanwhile, at the shop, the tension was so thick you could cut it with a knife. Margaret often stood for long periods in front of the locked processing room. Her eyes scanned every worker. Every so often, she'd drop the word rat into a conversation, making everyone glance at each other, pale-faced. Lucy cornered Darren one afternoon. Her voice shaking, she whispered that she'd heard Margaret on the phone, talking about bringing some people over to sort things out. Darren froze. He knew exactly what sorting things out meant. That night, in his flat, Darren opened the coffee tin and stared at the bone. He was torn. Should he hand the proof over to the police now? Or wait? He was terrified that if he just walked into a station, he'd be the one they arrested. In Perth, D.S. Evans got a new report. There were suspicious money transfers into a shell company controlled by Margaret. It wasn't huge amounts, but it was dodgy. It all pointed to one conclusion: there was a serious criminal operation behind that shop. Evans knew his next step. He had to meet Darren face to face. But he also knew the man who wrote that letter was living in terror. To gain his trust, He had to be careful. A few days later, Darren was sitting at the edge of the harbour, waiting for his truck to be loaded. Suddenly, a man came and sat next to him. He introduced himself as Jack Evans, from Perth. He said he wasn't there to cause trouble, he was there to help. He told Darren he knew he was the one who wrote the anonymous letter. Darren's blood ran cold. He wanted to run, but his legs felt like concrete. Evans looked at him calmly and said he believed Darren wasn't a criminal, he was a witness. He added that the police needed that proof, and that he couldn't keep it to himself. Darren didn't answer right away. He just looked down, his hands gripping his knees. He was trembling. In a voice that was barely a whisper, he asked if he'd be safe if he handed it over. Evans nodded, promising him and his team would protect him. The meeting was brief. Darren didn't hand anything over that day. He just said he'd think about it. But deep inside him, a small seed of hope had been planted. Elsewhere, Margaret received a call from someone with a low, cold voice. The person said that someone was starting to talk, and she needed to act fast before it all blew up. Margaret replied calmly that she already had a plan, and that no one who crossed her would walk away. That night, two rough-looking blokes were seen around the shop. They didn't go in, just sat at the pub across the laneway, watching. Lucy saw them and ran to find Darren. Panicked, she said, "They are not locals, Daz. I reckon they are the ones," she called. Darren felt his chest tighten. He knew his time was up. He had to decide, now. Hand over the proof, or wait and become the next victim. Back in his flat, he stared at the coffee tin for a long, long time. Then he closed his eyes and prayed for the strength to do the right thing. That morning, the Fremantle air was damp. The sea breeze carried a sharp, salty smell. Darren stood at the door of his flat, gripping a small, black plastic bag. Inside it was the coffee tin, and inside that, the pale white bone he'd hidden for so long. He hadn't slept. Every time he'd closed his eyes, he'd seen Sophie's face, smiling, then fading away. He knew the time had come. He couldn't carry this burden alone anymore. With heavy steps, he walked to the train station. From there, he caught the train up to Perth. He sat in the back, clutching the bag to his chest. Every time the train stopped, he felt like someone was watching him. He kept his head down, not daring to look out the window. At the police headquarters in Perth, DS Evans was waiting nervously. He'd gotten a short text that Darren was coming. When his office door knocked, Evans stood up immediately. Darren entered, his face pale, his eyes red-rimmed. He placed the plastic bag on the desk without a word. Evans opened it slowly. He took a long breath when he saw the contents of the tin. The tiny bone, still intact. As a detective, he'd seen a lot, but this made his skin crawl. Darren finally spoke. In a hoarse voice, he told him everything he'd seen. The machine running all night, the chemical smell, the disappearance of other workers, including Sophie. He confessed he'd been terrified to report it, convinced he'd be killed. Evans listened without interrupting, taking notes. When Darren finished, Evans put a hand on his shoulder. He said Darren's courage would save a lot of people. He promised him protection, but also warned him to be careful. Meanwhile, back in Freo, the atmosphere at the shop was becoming more menacing. Margaret had started calling workers in, one by one, questioning them in a cold tone. Her stare was penetrating, as if trying to read their souls. The workers just looked down, giving minimal answers. Lucy was trembling when it was her turn. Margaret stared at her for a long time, then said quietly that she didn't abide traitors. Outside, the two rough-looking blokes who had been at the pub were now seen hanging around the laneway more often. They didn't talk to anyone, they just watched. Lucy was more certain than ever that something terrible was about to happen. Word of other missing workers was also starting to spread through the neighborhood. A family was looking for their daughter. A neighbor was asking why a young man had never come home. All the stories led back to Margaret's shop. But no one dared to accuse her openly. Her name was too powerful. In Perth, the forensics team fast-tracked the lab work on the bone. The initial results came back human. It was the confirmation they needed. This was a major criminal case. But they still couldn't just storm in. They needed more evidence to build an ironclad case. Evans and Di Chen planned their strategy. They would place more undercover officers near the shop and start tracking the money flowing into Margaret's shell companies. Everything had to be done quietly. If Margaret got spooked, the evidence could disappear in an instant. Darren returned to Fremantle, his heart lighter, but the fear hadn't left. He knew Margaret might already suspect him. Every time he walked down the laneway to the shop, he felt eyes on him from behind a window. Lucy met him in secret, telling him Margaret was getting harsher and the mood inside was toxic. Darren told her to be careful, to keep her head down, and to stay as far away from the processing room as possible. But in his heart, he knew the danger was already too close. That night, Margaret stood for a long time in front of the processing room. Her hand was on the key that always hung around her neck. She muttered softly that the rat she was looking for would show itself soon. A thin smile crossed her face. A smile that made the few remaining workers shudder. In the distance, the undercover police team began logging the shop's nighttime activity. The grinder's hum could be heard late into the night. A light shone from under the door. They knew the truth was hiding behind that locked iron door. And in the middle of it all, Darren sat in his flat, praying. He knew he'd made his move. Now, he could only hope the police moved fast enough. Before Margaret made hers. In Perth, the small briefing room at the police headquarters was filled with maps, surveillance notes, and photos of Margaret's shop. Di Chen stood at a whiteboard, outlining the strategy in a firm voice. They couldn't wait any longer. The bone was proof enough to get a warrant. But they were choosing to move quietly. The goal wasn't just to arrest Margaret, but to dismantle any network she had. D.S. Evans suggested they raid the shop in the early morning, when it was at its busiest, making it harder for Margaret to hide or destroy anything. Other team members warned that Margaret was known to be cunning and had connections. If this raid failed, she could disappear like a ghost. Everyone knew the stakes were high. Meanwhile, in Fremantle, the shop was practically vibrating with tension. Margaret seemed to be spending more and more time locked in the processing room. When she came out, her face was cold and blank. She barely spoke, but when she did, everyone froze. The workers could feel something big was about to happen. Lucy secretly noted every change. She saw new supplies being brought in late at night. Big, metal drums were placed in the storage shed. No one knew what was in them. A stinging, chemical smell seeped out, making a few workers gag. But no one dared to ask. Darren was more certain than ever that Margaret was planning something. When he tried to warn a younger worker to be careful, the kid just shook his head and whispered, "Better to stay quiet than to disappear." Those words hit Darren hard, making him realize everyone was living in the same terror. That night, in her large house connected directly to the shop, Margaret sat at an old wooden desk by candlelight. In front of her was a small ledger, filled with numbers and names. She wrote quickly, as if making a final list. She would occasionally pause, look at an old, faded photo of her long-dead family, and then go back to writing. A thin smile played on her lips, making her face look grotesque in the flickering light. She knew the police might be sniffing around. But she wasn't scared. To her, as long as she held the key to the processing room and the secret to the recipe, no one could truly stop her. Even if she had to sacrifice the people around her, she was willing. In Perth, the tactical team prepped their gear. Their vehicles were unmarked. The team members were given new covers, council workers, Port Authority staff. Everything was designed to avoid attracting attention. DS Evans got an update from Intel. The two rough-looking blokes seen around the shop had been identified. They were known bikie enforcers from out of state. They were Margaret's muscle. This new information made Di Chen even more certain. The raid had to happen now, before there was another victim. In Fremantle that night, Darren couldn't sleep. From his window, he saw shadows moving back and forth in the laneway. He heard hushed whispers, like people searching for something. His gut feeling was terrible. He knew time was out. He decided to write a short note to his mum back home. In it, he just asked her to pray for his safety, without explaining what was happening. At the same time, Lucy heard shocking news. One of the mail packers hadn't shown up for his shift that morning. The official word was that he wasn't a good fit and had been sent home. But Lucy knew that was a lie. Her fear peaked, and she seriously considered running. But where could she go? It felt like every road out of Freo was under Margaret's control. On the final night before the operation, Di Chen gathered the team. He told them all to stay calm, not to get emotional, and to focus on the evidence. He knew this case wasn't just about crime, it was about fighting a terrifying shadow of power. And as the sun began to rise, and the narrow streets of Fremantle filled with the sounds of the morning market, no one knew that several of the people milling about were actually undercover officers. They were all waiting for the signal to move. Inside the shop, Margaret stood, her face calm. Her hand gripped the key that hung from the chain on her neck. She whispered softly to herself that all